A big hello and welcome to episode 35 of the Within the Boggerwood podcast, which also happens to be the first episode of year 3. I'd like to start off with some housekeeping to kick off year 3. As you may know, back at the beginning of February, I changed podcast hosts. So far, all the podcasting platforms that I'm aware of have updated the podcast feed to the new host, Acast, but of course we lost all the download stats for the first 2 years on the previous host. Episode 34 was the first episode on the new host, and has performed better than any of the previous 33 on the old host, but I'd like to ask a quick favour. If you're new to the podcast, if you've got some time, would you consider having a listen to some of the old episodes? Downloads and listens to the old episodes would help the podcast out immensely. For those out there interested in stats, the focus of listeners to the podcast has also shifted since the move to Acast. Previously, the old host was registering that the majority of listeners were based in the US. Now we have the UK as the prime audience, followed by the US, then Australia and Canada, with multiple download listeners in Ireland, New Zealand, France, India, Italy, Brazil, Latvia, the United Arab Emirates, Germany, Bangladesh, Cambodia and Barbados. There's also been a swing from Apple to Spotify for the most used platform. It honestly amazes me that this little Northern English and Scottish Borders podcast has literally a worldwide audience, so thank you all wherever you are. Over on YouTube, the podcast episodes are all available to play as YouTube videos rather than on YouTube Music, so if YouTube is more your thing, then please check out the Within the Boggerwood channel. The first 2 episodes of the Investigation Bare Bones project are also available, the 2 episodes being the introduction and the first part of the photography investigation, where I discussed the subject of orbs. The orb subject in paranormal photography is a contentious one, and I have to admit that I wasn't surprised to see that one of the first viewers hit the dislike button almost within minutes of the episode going live, but luckily the likes now outweigh the single dislike, which makes me think I'm on the right track. So a small aside. Back at Christmas I closed down the Patreon account for the project and in its place set up a non-subscription Buy Me a Coffee account, where if anyone wants to help contribute towards the project, they can simply buy me a coffee. So I'd like to give a huge thanks to Jackie for her 5 coffees and a lovely message. So now that the housekeeping is done with, let's get on with the episode. I'm going to be trialling a slightly different format than the previous 2 seasons, concentrating on 1 or 2 stories per episode. This means that I should be able to get more episodes done in less time, and more of the episodes will become shorter bite-sized pieces that are easier to reference and digest. Now, as expected, this one didn't go according to plan. I'd started the research on the tale of Lily of Lumley, but quite quickly got sidetracked into what became a deep dive into the murder of Anne Walker and the rather interesting way that her murderers were identified. So please pour a brew and settle in for a tale of intrigue, murder, ghosts, and a 17th century debunker feeling the contempt of his contemporaries. In the year 1632, 2 men were convicted of the murder of Anne Walker at the Durham Assizes. One of the men was her uncle, a wealthy yeoman named John Walker, who also stood accused of making her pregnant, and the other was a friend of his, Mark Sharp, a miner originally from Lancashire. Now, for those who don't know, assize courts were the backbone of the criminal judicial system in the 17th century and had operated since the medieval period. The term assize comes from the Old French assise, meaning session or legal action, and the assize courts dealt with all manner of criminal cases such as murder, highway robbery, witchcraft, forgery, theft, trespass and vagrancy. During the 17th century, the assizes across England were usually held twice a year, once at Lent, also referred to as the Spring Assizes, and once during the summer months, though Durham was a little different to the norm. Some of the Durham Assize records dating back to the 16th century have survived and are held in the National Archives at Kew. It seems though that until 1536 in Durham the justices were commissioned by the Bishop of Durham, as the Palatinate of Durham lay outside the Royal Assize, but in that year the Crown took control of the commissioning justices. Records do show us though that the Durham Assizes were only held annually in Durham City until the year 1819. So why, in a time of murder, superstition and witchcraft, does the execution of Walker and Sharp stand out? Basically, it's because both men were convicted on the testimony given by a local miller, who had been given all of the incriminating evidence by the ghost of the murder victim herself, from the location of Anne's body to the location of the murder weapon and the blood-soaked clothing belonging to the murderer. So 2 men were executed on the testimony of an apparition. In early 1673, 40 years after the execution, Mr. John Webster, self-titled practitioner of physics, began his work on examining witchcraft and apparitions. His book was published in 1677 under the title The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft, with the subject of the book being the tongue twister of The Displaying of Supposed Witchcraft, wherein it is affirmed that there are many sorts of deceivers and impostors and divers persons under a passive delusion of melancholy and fancy, but that there is a corporeal league made betwixt the devil and the witch, or that he sucks on the witch's body, as a carnal copulation, or that witches are turned into cats, dogs, raise tempests, or the like, is utterly denied and disproved. Wherein also is handled the existence of angels and spirits, the truth of apparitions, the nature of astral and sidereal spirits, the force of charms and philters, with other abstruse matters. Webster was born in 1610 at Thornton in Craven in North Yorkshire. Through his life he was a cleric, a physician, a writer and researcher, a physicist and chemist who incidentally studied under an alchemist at Gresham College. With this rather interesting and mixed background, in a time where superstition, hate and witchcraft were prevalent, Webster was known to argue against the existence of witchcraft, a 17th century debunker if you like. So back in the 1670s, here was a man arguing that most cases of witchcraft and apparitions were essentially caused by ignorance of the real workings of the world, where superstitious beliefs held by the masses and by influential figures caused men of science and learning to suffer persecution. An interesting example he made was our learned and most industrious anatomist, Dr. Harvey, who has found forth in evidence to the world that a rare and profitable discovery of the circulation of the blood did undergo the like fate, who for 18 or 20 years together did groan under the heavy censure of all the Galenists and expert anatomists almost in Europe, and was railed upon and bitterly written against. Webster, however, while writing about this, also displayed his own prejudice and assertions because of his own beliefs. As far as I understand in his writings, and feel free to argue this, Webster firmly believed that a human was made of 3 elements. The first being the physical body, the second being the astral spirit that wanders the earth after the death of the physical body, and the third being an incorporeal soul that returns to God after the death of the physical body. So to Webster, most apparitions were the product of the mind, or were projections created by God, or were caused by the astral spirits of the dead, essentially an echo left behind while their soul had returned to God. The tale of Anne Walker's apparition appearing to the miller was still fresh and being told across the country at this time, and in chapter 16 of his book, Webster examined the case of the execution of Sharp and Walker. He stated the following: About the year of our Lord 1632, as near as I can remember having lost my notes and the copy of the letter to Sergeant Hutton, but am sure that I most perfectly remember the substance of the story, near unto Chester in the street there lived one Walker, a yeoman man of good estate, and a widower, who had a young woman to his kinswoman that kept his house, who was by the neighbours suspected to be with child, and was towards the dark of the evening one night sent away with one Mark Sharp, who was a collier, a one that had digged coals under the ground, and one that had been born in Blakeburn Hundred in Lancashire, and so she was not heard of a long time, and no noise or little was made about it. In the winter time after, one James Graham or Grime, for so in that country they call them, being a miller, and living about 2 miles from the place where Walker lived, was one night alone very late in the mill grinding corn, and as about 12 or 1 o'clock at night he came down the stairs from having been putting corn in the hopper, the mill doors being shut, there stood a woman upon the midst of the floor, with her hair about her head, hanging down and all bloody, with 5 large wounds in her head. He being much affrighted and amazed, begun to bless him, and at last asked her who she was, and what she wanted. To which she said, I am the spirit of such a woman, who lived with Walker, and being got with child by him, he promised me to send me to a private place, where I should be well looked to until I was brought in bed, and well again, and then I should come again and keep his house. And accordingly, said the apparition, I was one night late sent away with one Mark Sharp, who upon a moor, naming a place that the miller knew, slew me with a pick, such as men dig coals with, and gave me 5 wounds. And after threw my body into a coal pit hard by, and hid the pick under a bank, and his shoes and stockings being bloody he endeavoured to wash, but seeing the blood would not wash forth, he hid them there. And the apparition further told the miller that he must be the man to reveal it, or else she must still appear and haunt him. The miller returned home very sad and heavy, but spoke not one word of what he had seen, but eschewed as much as he could to stay in the mill within night without company, thinking thereby to escape the seeing again of the frightful apparition. But notwithstanding one night when it begun to be dark, the apparition met him again, and seemed very fierce and cruel, and threatened him that if he did not reveal the murder she would continue to pursue and haunt him. Yet for all this he still concealed it, until St. Thomas Eve before Christmas, when being soon after sunset walking in his garden she appeared again, and then so threatened and affrighted him that he faithfully promised to reveal it the next morning. In the morning he went to a magistrate and made the whole matter known with all of the circumstances, and diligent search being made, the body was found in the coal pit with 5 wounds in the head, and the pick and shoes and stockings yet bloody in every circumstance as the apparition had related to the miller. Whereupon Walker and Sharp were both apprehended, but would confess nothing. At the assizes following, I think it was at Durham, they were arraigned, found guilty, condemned and executed, but I could never hear that they confessed the fact. There were some that reported that the apparition did appear to the judge or to the foreman of the jury, who was alive in Chester in the street about 10 years ago, as I have been credibly informed, but of that I have no certainty. There are many persons yet alive that can remember the strange murder and the discovery of it, for it was, and sometimes yet is, as much discoursed of in the North Country as anything that almost hath ever been heard of, and the relation printed, although now not to be begotten. I relate this with the greatest confidence, though I may fail in some of the circumstances, because I saw and read the letter that was sent to Sergeant Hutton, who then lived in Goldborough in Yorkshire, from the judge before whom Walker and Sharp were tried, and by whom they were condemned, and had a copy of it until about the year 1658, when I had it and many other books and papers taken from me. To this story Webster then adds his own observations, and this I confess to be one of the most convincing stories, being of undoubted verity, that I have ever read, heard or knew of, and carrieth with it the most evident force to make it the most incredulous spirit, to be satisfied that there are really sometimes such things as apparitions. And though it be not easy to assign the true and proper cause of such a strange effect, yet must we not measure all things to be or not to be true or false, according to the extent of our understandings. For if there be many of the magnalia nature that lie hidden from the wisest of men, then much more may the magnalia Dei be unknown to us, whose judgments are unsearchable and his ways past finding out. And as in the rest we cannot ascribe this strange apparition to any diabolical operation, nor to the soul of the woman murdered, so we must conclude that either it was merely wrought by the divine power, or by the astral spirit of the murdered woman, which last doth seem most rational. So basically, Webster tells us that Walker and Sharp were executed essentially on the word of the miller, who claimed to know the murder details as he was told them by the apparition of the victim. So now enter into the debate one Dr. Henry Moore. Moore was a philosopher and theologian who had a different view on God and the non-physical world, and who regarded Webster's work with amusement and obvious contempt. Moore had developed the theory of the spirit of nature, which was the grey area between God and the physical world, which Moore claimed explained the strange and unusual, such as magic and apparitions. Moore's letter in response to Webster's account of the Anne Walker apparition was published in 1681 in Glanville's Seducissimus Triumphatus, or Full and Plain Evidence Concerning Witches and Apparitions, in 2 parts, the first treating of their possibility, the second of their real existence. But of discoveries of murder I never met with any story more plain and unexceptionable than that in Mr. John Webster, his display of supposed witchcraft. The book indeed itself, I confess, is but a weak and impertinent piece, but that story weighty and convincing. Henry Moore claims to have looked at the case of Anne Walker in 1659, while writing his books on the immortality of the soul, when he then contacted a friend of his based in the north to look into the story. His letter includes Mr. Shepherdson's reply. I have done what I can to inform myself of the passage of Sharp and Walker. There are very few men that I could meet that were then men or at the trial, saving these two in the enclosed paper, both men at the time and both at the trial. And for Mr. Lumley, he lived next door to Walker, and what he hath given under his hand can depose if there were occasion. The other gentleman writ his attestation with his own hand, but I being not there, got not his name to it. I could have sent you 20 hands that could have said thus much and much more by hearsay, but I thought these not proper that could speak from their own eyes and ears. Now for Mr. Lumley's testimony, it is this. Mr. William Lumley of Lumley, being an ancient gentleman, at the time of the trial of Walker and Sharp upon the murder of Anne Walker, faith, that he doth very well remember what the said Anne was servant to Walker, and that she was supposed to be with child, but would not disclose by whom. But being removed to her aunt's in the same town, called Dame Carey, told her aunt that he that had got her with child would take care both for her and it, and bid her not trouble herself. After some time she had been at her aunt's, it was observed that Sharp came to Lumley one night, being a sworn brother of the said Walkers, and they two that night called her forth from her aunt's house, which night she was murdered. About 14 days after the murder, there appeared to one Grime, a fuller, at his mill, 6 miles from Lumley, the likeness of a woman, with her hair about her head, and the appearance of 5 wounds in her head, as the said Grime gave it in evidence, that appearance bid him go to a justice of the peace, and relate to him how that Walker and Sharp had murdered her, in such a place as she was murdered. But he, fearing to disclose a thing of that nature against a person of credit as Walker was, would not have done it, but she continually appearing night by night to him, and pulling the clothes off his bed, told him he should never rest until he had disclosed it. Upon which the said Grime did go to a justice of the peace, and related the whole matter. Whereupon the justice of the peace granted warrants against Walker and Sharp, and committed them to prison, but they found bail to appear at the next assizes, at which time they came to their trial, and upon evidence of the circumstances, with that of Grime of the appearance, they were both found guilty and executed. Moore then continues with his narrative. The other testimony is that of Mr. James Smart of the city of Durham, who saith that the trial of Sharp and Walker was in the month of August 1631, before Judge Davenport. One Mr. Fairhair giveth in evidence upon oath that he see the likeness of a child stand upon Walker's shoulders during the time of the trial, at which time the judge was very much troubled, and gave sentence that night the trial was, which was a thing never used in Durham before nor after. Moore then goes into the differences between Webster's narrative and Shepherdson's research, and it's plain that Moore's letter is more of an attempt to discredit Webster than it was to document the phenomena. Out of which 2 testimonies several things may be corrected or supplied in Mr. Webster's story, though it be evident enough that in the main they agree, for that is but a small disagreement as to the year, when Mr. Webster says about the year of our Lord 1632, and Mr. Smart 1631. But unless at Durham they have assizes but once in the year, I understand not so well how Sharp and Walker should be apprehended some little while after St. Thomas Day, as Mr. Webster has it, and be tried the next assizes at Durham, and yet that be in August according to Mr. Smart. With this statement, Moore is suggesting that the timeline in Webster's account is wrong, but by doing so he shows his own lack of knowledge of the judicial system in Durham, which sure enough did only meet annually until the early 19th century. Out of Mr. Lumley's testimony the Christian name of the young woman is supplied, as also the name of the town near Chester in the street named Lumley. The circumstances also of Walker's sending away his kinswoman with Mark Sharp are supplied out of Mr. Lumley's narrative, and the time rectified by telling it was about 14 days till the spectre appeared after the murder, whereas Mr. Webster makes it a long time. Webster suggested that the apparition appeared during the winter after Anne Walker went missing. It's likely this was assumed, as allegedly the miller finally reacted to the apparition's threats on St. Thomas Eve, which is December the 20th. 2 errors also more are corrected in Mr. Webster's narration by Mr. Lumley's testimony. The distance of the miller from Lumley where Walker dwelt, which was 6 miles, not 2 miles as Mr. Webster has it, and also that it was not a mill to grind corn in, but a fuller's mill. Now, this is interesting, as it puts the site of Graham's mill in two different areas. Webster's location of 2 miles from Lumley fits with the currently accepted location of the story, which is the site of an old mill 2 miles south of Lumley Castle on the River Wear, which I'll go into later. William Lumley's testimony, however, putting the site 6 miles from Lumley, opens the field considerably. He also makes the distinction between Webster's story detailing a corn mill and his own of a fulling mill. For those that aren't aware, a fulling mill was used for cleaning and thickening cloth that had nothing to do with grain at all. A 6-mile radius from Lumley Castle, home of William Lumley, takes the story as far west as Burnup, east as far as New Silksworth, and north into Low Fell. It could take us south all the way to Durham City, and the fulling mill on the river there, which is the only 17th century fulling mill that I'm aware of in that 6-mile radius. The apparition night by night pulling the clothes off Grimes' bed, omitted in Mr. Webster's story, may be supplied out of Mr. Lumley's and Mr. Smart's testimony, puts it out of controversy that the trial was at Durham and before Judge Davenport, which is omitted by Mr. Webster. And whereas Mr. Webster says there were some that reported that the apparition did appear to the judge or the foreman of the jury, but of that he knows no certainty, this confession of his, as it is a sign he would not write anything in this story of which he was not certain for the main, so here is a very seasonable supply for this out of Mr. Smart, who affirms that he heard one Mr. Fairhair give evidence upon oath that he saw the likeness of a child stand upon Walker's shoulders during the time of the trial. It is likely this Mr. Fairhair might be the foreman of the jury, and in that the judge was so very much troubled that himself might see the same apparition as Mr. Webster says report went, though the mistake in Mr. Webster is that it was the apparition of the woman. But this of the child was very fit and opposite, placed on his shoulders as one that was justly loaded or charged with that crime of getting his kinswoman with child, as well as complotting with Sharp to murder her. So basically, Moore's issue with Webster's account in this instance is that Webster pretty much dismissed the idea of apparitional activity at the trial occurring, as he couldn't confirm it, and so doesn't give much credence to it. Moore, on the other hand, appears to take the testimonies of Smart and Fairhair at face value, more to the point of saying that Webster got it wrong, as he suggested it was the apparition of the murdered woman that appeared, rather than the fact that an apparitional child appeared on Walker's shoulder. The letter also which he mentions writ from the judge before whom the trial was heard, to Sergeant Hutton, it is plain out of Mr. Smart's testimony that it was from Judge Davenport, which in all likelihood was a very full and punctual narrative of the whole, and enabled Mr. Webster in some considerable things to be more particular than Mr. Lumley. But the agreement is so exact for the main that there is no doubt to be made of the truth of the apparition, but that this, forsooth, must not be the soul of Anne Walker, but her astral spirit, this is but a fantastic conceit of Webster and his Paracelsians, which I have sufficiently shown the folly of in the Scholia on my Immortality of the Soul. Now this is an odd close to Moore's narrative, as he essentially admits that Webster's source, being a detailed account from the judge, likely allowed Webster to provide a more detailed account than his own source, but then decides to have that last word by saying that Webster's assertion that the apparition was an astral spirit rather than the murdered woman's soul was a fantastic conceit and folly. So, moving forward to the 19th century, and the tale of the murder of Anne Walker was still newsworthy. In the early 19th century, Moore and Webster's accounts were still being used without much embellishment, but by the end of the century the story began to change subtly. In some versions, Anne Walker was no longer the kinswoman of Walker the Yeoman, but just a servant of a nameless master. The version of her apparition appearing to James Graham at the mill was also changing, with the miller going to the law the morning after her appearance, rather than the original story's long wait and haunting. Another version, doing its rounds in the newspapers of 1890, had the story occurring in the year 1680. Walker was noted as a yeoman of good character and agained scandal with getting his young relative pregnant. In this version, she was relocated to live with her aunt, Dame Cave, but was removed from the house in November 1680 and murdered by Walker and his friend Sharp. The fuller is now cited as living nearly 6 miles from Lumley and had to come downstairs in the mill to get ready to go home. The story then continues as per the original, with the addition that they were admitted to trial in August 1681, with the apparition of the murdered woman appearing at the trial to confirm the pair's guilt. A version of the story in 1896 was heading back towards the grassroots of the story, including the correct dates and the corn mill version of the tale. This version has the apparition of Anne Walker appearing 3 times before the miller went to the magistrate. The principal witness for the prosecution was James Graham, the miller, who solemnly swore to the 3 visits of the ghost and the revelation made to him. He was personally unknown, except by sight, to either of the prisoners, and it was never suggested on their behalf that he could have had any possible motive in thus charging them with murder, nor was any other way suggested by which the miller could have discovered the body of the murdered woman except through the revelation of the ghost. A couple of years earlier, another newspaper version of the story added a little further to the narrative by attempting to flesh out the miller's character. The story suggests that the reason that his testimony was taken as fact was due to his character, and that he was not a superstitious man and was known to laugh at the very idea of ghosts and apparitions, and was said to be a jolly and kind man, even noting that he sang songs at Christmas. This story was placed in December 1631, when the miller, now named John rather than James, was having to work all hours to keep up with grinding corn, ready for the incoming winter. However, interest in the story seemed to be fading going into the 20th century. A newspaper article in 1905 reads, "A girl named Anne Walker was supposed to have been sent away for her own good by a substantial farmer. Sometime afterwards, a so-called apparition appeared to a neighbour, with its head all bloody from wounds, and telling him that she had been murdered by the farmer and an accomplice." In 1919, the story read, August 1631. John Walker, widower and yeoman of Lumley, was convicted and executed for murdering his kinswoman and housekeeper, Anne Walker. Mark Sharp, a Lancashire collier, seems to have been the actual murderer, Walker being accessory both before and after the fact. It appears that the victim had been ruined by Walker, and her ghost is said to have haunted and ordered one Graham, a fuller, to denounce the murderers, the apparition displaying 5 head wounds and threatening Graham if he neglected her demands. Subsequent search led to the finding of her body, wounded just as described by the fuller, in a coal pit, along with Sharp's pick and blood-stained shoes and stockings. In 1920, an article named The Uncharted Coast, A New Light on Old Crimes, appeared in the Strand magazine. This article made a good summary of all of the tales to date, concentrating on the works of Webster and Moore. The author of the article was Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. After that, there are mentions in local papers in the 1950s and 90s, and at some point the tale also morphed to include the Bloody Tree, an old oak tree on the Old Mill Lane, said locally to be the location where Anne Walker was murdered before she was then hidden in an old mine. Thing is, the earliest mention of the tree coming into the tale comes in the form of a newspaper article in 1994, with nothing before that. By 2004, the story, for want of a better term, had been dumbed down majorly. Due to copyright, I can't read out the story, but the gist is that the miller John Graham had a neighbour called Walker, whose cousin, Anne Walker, had moved to the farm and disappeared. 2 weeks later, the miller had been out working late when he saw Anne stroll past the mill, but he got a shock when he saw the girl had bloody head wounds. She carried on her stroll and vanished near an old mine. The next day the mine was searched and her body, bloodied clothes, and a pickaxe belonging to the local tough named Mark Sharp were found. A doctor examined the body and found she had been pregnant, and the locals decided her uncle Walker had done the deed, then colluded with Mark Sharp to kill her. Both Walker and Sharp were executed after a trial that lasted just a single day. Right, so if everybody is still awake after all that, let's just summarise what we actually know. We know, according to the Assizes, that John Walker and Mark Sharp were executed in August 1632, convicted on the testimony of the miller and his apparitional source for the murder of Anne Walker. Apparently, the miller's original testimony is held in the Bodleian Library, though to be fair, I don't have access to the library and can't find it in the online search facility. The case was examined by Webster, writing in the 1670s, some 40 years after the event, but having been in the possession of a copy of the letter from the judge to Sergeant Hutton detailing the trial, though of course he had lost the letter in 1658 and admitted to working from memory. Webster says that the execution took place in 1632. The mill was located 2 miles from Lumley and was a corn mill with the miller named James Graham or Grime. The apparition did not appear to Graham until the winter of the year she disappeared, with the miller delivering his evidence to the magistrate on the 20th of December. Henry Moore asked a northern friend in 1659 to look into the local knowledge of the alleged murder, the results of which were published in 1681 and seemed more of an attempt to call Webster's work into disrepute. Moore's source, Shepherdson, cited William of Lumley as his primary source and claimed that the apparition appeared at the mill 14 days after the murder, assuming that Anne was murdered on the same day that Sharp had removed her from Anne's house. In the Shepherdson-Lumley version, the then miller was named Grime, but it was a fulling mill, not a corn mill, and 6 miles from Lumley, not the two mentioned by Webster. Moore then states that the trial was in August 1631, not 1632 as claimed by Webster, and that the second testimony at the trial was by James Smart of Durham City, who claimed that a Mr. Fairhair was able to see the spirit of a child on Walker's shoulder at the time of the trial, suggesting that Walker was the father of the murdered unborn child. Fairhair, giving this statement as evidence under oath, was said to have troubled the judge greatly, who sentenced the two men on the same day. So to summarise, on the subject of date, the information available probably suggests that Anne Walker was murdered in late 1631, with the remains being found on the 20th of December of that year, with Walker and Sharp tried and convicted in August 1632. William Lumley's suggestion that the mill where the apparition appeared was a fulling mill 6 miles away from Lumley itself seems to be at odds with the original tale, which was based on the testimony the miller himself had given and had been transcribed in a letter by the judge himself. As far as I can tell, Lumley's testimony was to Shepherdson in 1659, not at the trial itself, so this takes it to nearly 30 years after the event itself before the fulling mill change in the narrative was introduced. During that time, the Lumleys did own a fulling mill near Bulburn, and while outside of the 6-mile radius association, could have influenced the ancient gentleman's narrative. So, taking this into account, and with most of the accounts suggesting the corn mill at Great Lumley as the actual location, I decided to have a look and see if I could find a trace of the mill there. Sure enough, 2 miles south of Lumley Castle and a mile south of Great Lumley was a mill. By the time the tithe apportionment of 1840 was undertaken, the land was owned by the Earl of Durham and occupied by Christopher Henry Bainbridge. The associated map shows what appears to be only the remnants of a track remaining along with the wheel pit for the mill, all set north of where the burn meets the river, with a ford running across north of the confluence point. The field next to the assumed mill was noted as grass, and the adjoining woodland as plantation, the fields to the east as Millbank Head. The harbour wagonway can also be seen running through and bridging the river towards the harbour pit, with the fields south of the pit known as Mill Field. By 1857, the Ordnance Survey mapping shows no evidence of the wheel pit or any structural remains. The woodland is named Old Mill Wood, with Old Mill Ford, stepping stones and also the harbour wagonway plotted, though by this time the wagonway had closed down and its original crossing point across the river had been removed. By 1895, the wagonway was simply marked as a track and the ford had been removed, so as it seemed that all traces of the mill had likely been removed by the end of the 19th century, I didn't have much hope in finding anything, though a quick look online found one website claiming a photograph of the remains of the mill, but I know just how easy it is to find a wall or structure in the vicinity of a site and just presume its identity. First task was finding a way down to the mill site. Looking at the modern Ordnance Survey, there was little change since the turn of the 20th century, so the shortest route seemed to be from the east. I parked the car down at the Finkel parking area on Cocken Road and walked up Cocken Lane, only to find the old wagonway track no longer a public right-of-way. I had a chat with the tenant farmer and the landowner, who explained that their land from the old wagonway south of the Bow Burn was now for game, with gamekeepers out on patrol, and they suggested I try Old Mill Lane from the north. So it was back to the car and up to Great Lumley, where I got parked and made my way down the lane. It was amazing to think that the track, a public right-of-way, was 16th or 17th century in date, and possibly even medieval. I soon passed the tree known as the Bloody Oak, said to be the spot where Sharp killed Anne Walker, and while the tree is old, I wouldn't say it was old enough to be standing when the murder took place, but then I'm no tree expert. The fields bordering the lane had been ploughed, and I noticed a lot of broken stone, bricks and 19th century ceramics in the soil, as well as a couple of fragments of what could have been medieval pottery. As the lane headed toward Old Mill Wood, the beaten track turned earthen, and I paused at the edge of the wood, trying to work out a path down the gully. The old lane itself had crumbled and had been washed away, and the route down was uneven to say the least, though fragments of worked stone were visible along with the remnant of a stone drain that would have run alongside the lane. At the base of the lane, the woodland track split into three. One ran east along the old wagonway route, but had a sign detailing private land. The next ran south along the riverside, but again private land. But luckily the one I was interested in, running north along the riverside, was still publicly accessible. Unluckily, however, the area was already heavily overgrown for the time of year, and while I thought I'd found an old fording point, there was still no sign of the mill structure, barring a few potentially worked stones I found beneath the roots of a tree, and slightly further up the river there seemed to be a rough rectangular shape by the river edge, completely covered over with vegetation, but with what felt like very stony material beneath the feet. So unfortunately, with only a mild confidence that there were structural remains beneath the turf on site, I decided to head back to the car, but as I sweated my way back up the gully and slope, suddenly realising that while it was a mere mile back to the car, it was all uphill, my brain cell decided to pull together a suspicion I'd been forming, and one suggested only mildly and dismissed in the research on the case. My suspicion and question is simply this: did James Graham, miller extraordinaire, get away with murder in 1631? To me it's the obvious answer, with the tale of the apparition made up by the miller to move suspicion away from himself. Obviously this is mere speculation, but as it is thought that Walker's farm was likely by Mill Lane, then it would be very likely that the miller would have come in contact with the farm domestic servants, such as Anne Walker. As previously mentioned, the climate was one of massive suspicion and superstition at the time of the murder. You have to remember that 18 years later, Newcastle saw the start of the Newcastle witch trials, which culminated in 15 people being executed for witchcraft on the town moor. So I did a little bit more reading, specifically looking more at Webster's research, and in 1623, 9 years before the execution of Walker and Sharp, a peculiar case occurred in the North Riding of Yorkshire, again reported on by Webster, which was said to be the talk of the North. About the year of our Lord 1623 or 24, one Fletcher of Rascal, a town in the North Riding of Yorkshire near unto the forest of Gantras, a yeoman of good estate, did marry a young lusty woman from Thornton Briggs, who had been formerly kind with one Ralph Reynard, who kept an inn within half a mile from Rascal in the high road betwixt York and Thusk, his sister living with him. This Reynard continued in unlawful lust with the said Fletcher's wife, who not content therewith conspired the death of Fletcher, one Mark Dunn being made privy and hired to assist in the murder, which Reynard and Dunn accomplished upon the May Day by drowning Fletcher. As they came all three together from a town called Hooby, and acquainting the wife with the deed, she gave them a sack therein to convey his body, which they did and buried it in Reynard's backside or croft, where an old oak root had been stubbed up, and sowed mustard seed upon the place thereby to hide it. So they continued their wicked course of lust and drunkenness, and the neighbours did much wonder at Fletcher's absence, but his wife did excuse it, and said that he was but gone aside for fear of some writs being served upon him. And so it continued until about the 7th day of July, when Reynard, going to Topcliffe Fair, and setting up his horse in the stable, the spirit of Fletcher in his usual shape and habit did appear unto him, and said, O Raff, repent, repent, for my revenge is at hand. And ever after, until he was put in the jail, it seemed to stand before him, whereby he became sad and restless, and his own sister, overhearing his confession and relation of it to another person, did through fear of losing her own life, immediately reveal it to Sir William Sheffield, who lived in Rascal, and was a justice of the peace. Whereupon they were all three apprehended and sent to the jail at York, where they were all three condemned, and so executed accordingly, near to the place where Reynard lived, and where Fletcher was buried, the two men being hung up in irons, and the woman buried under the gallows. I have recited this story punctually, as a thing that hath been very much fixed in my memory, being then but young, and as a certain truth, I being, with many more, an ear-witness of their confessions, and an eye-witness of their executions, and likewise saw Fletcher when he was taken up, where they had buried him in his clothes, which were a green sustained doublet pinked upon white, grey breeches, and his walking boots and brass spurs without rowels. Webster then comments on the story. Some will say there was no intrinsic apparition to Reynard at all, but that all this did only arise from the guilt of his own conscience, which represented the shape of Fletcher in his fancy. But then why was it precisely done at that time and not at any others, it being far from the place of the murder or the place they may have buried Fletcher, and nothing there that might bring it to his remembrance more than at another time? And if it had only risen from within him and appeared so in his fancy, it had been more likely to have been moved when he was in or near his backside where the murdered body of Fletcher lay. But certain it is that he affirmed that it was the shape and voice of Fletcher, as assuredly to his eyes and ears as ever he had seen or heard him in his life. The tale of Reynard and the spirit of Fletcher was a talking point throughout the north, so could the miller have heard the story and taken inspiration from it, along with essentially using the fear of witches and spirits at the time to make a story that was so incredible it would be believed? Certainly, if you dismiss the notion that ghosts are real, or that the miller held psychic powers as Conan Doyle later alluded to, then how else could his exact knowledge of the burial place of the body, bloodied clothing and murdered weapon be explained? While it was noted later that neither Sharp nor Walker knew the miller personally, but had seen him around, it doesn't mean that Graham didn't know them. If Walker was the local wealthy farmer, the miller could well have had an issue with him relating to the harvest or timetables, especially if, as the tale goes, he had to work late to keep on top of the incoming grain. The miller could also have easily gotten hold of some of the Sharp's clothing, along with his pickaxe, if they had lived less than a mile apart. So did James Graham have an illicit affair with Anne Walker, whereupon she became pregnant, and he framed Walker and Sharp for her murder when he did away with her to avoid scandal, making up the story of the apparition and letting fear and superstition damn Walker and Sharp to what should have been his own fate? That is something that can never be known. Nearly 400 years have passed, all evidence has gone, and even the ghost of Anne Walker hasn't been seen now for 393 years, as all traces of the apparition, according to the miller, vanished on the execution of Walker and Sharp. I do hope that you've enjoyed this story, episode 35 and the first episode of year 3 of the Within the Boggerwood podcast. As well as this audio podcast, episode 35 will also be on YouTube, with maps and extra video and photography content from my visit to Old Mill Wood. Anne Walker's tale also features as the first story in the website's new Tales section, where you can find the written version of this episode, along with a list of sources that I used for the episode and suggested further reading, along with some challenges if you wish to take research into this story further. So, until next time, take good care of yourselves and stay spooky. One thing I don't like about this is that it all appears to be downhill, as you would expect going into a valley. But it just means I've got to walk back up the hill to get back out again. Now I think this track here will head back along the old line of the wagon way. But obviously private, no public right of way. From the other end it was the same. unfortunately, but I also heard probably the gamekeepers out shooting earlier on, so you know, best stick to the main path. Now, that broken tree that I've just passed, I've actually been told in several places that trees like that are actually being caused by a Bigfoot, British Bigfoot, knocking trees down, rather than, say, for example, a storm. You can probably tell by my tone of voice which one I believe. Unfortunately, this looks as though it's about as far as we can go. It says end of public footpath, which I assume is basically the river and beyond down that way. Now, in theory, this should actually be the site of the mill. As with everywhere else, ground's very uneven. By the looks of things, all of the land south of the O'Mill Wood track along the Bowburn must belong to the landowner who's turned the land to game shooting, and that's all private. So we're going to stick to the banks running north of that track, which must be in the same land ownership as the Old Mill Lane and the public pathway. Quite a lot of stone underfoot in this area. You can feel it poking out from between all of the roots. And that would be a goose. This area here, I think, is where the 1830s tithe shows that there might be the remnant of the water wheel pit, or the wheel pit of the mill. If I can get down to the river side, I might be able to see any stonework in the side. There is a picture online that allegedly shows stonework associated with the old mill, but I've only seen one and it doesn't say where it is. And at this moment in time, considering that in theory there was only a water wheel still, a wheel pit still visible in the 1830s, kind of suggests there probably is not going to be any visible stonework of anything else now.
lovely spot. I know the old maps show Ford across, but I think that's down in the bit that we can't go into because it's private land. But the water wheel, or the tide suggested that Old Mill Lane came down on the southward side of the slope, hit the base and then jutted north where the mill building would have been. So again, this is where we should be seeing remnants in the side, if it wasn't all completely robbed out, of course, which it probably was. Now in this area here we seem to have potentially a fording point, potentially. Obviously, as I say, I think that based on this bank side the river's changed course quite a lot, and quite recently as well. As I said, probably the last lot of floods did quite a lot of damage. But so far the only traces I can see of structure are actually only 2 stones, which obviously 2 stones in a row do not make a structure. But looking at the roots of this big old tree, try and get out of the shade. Actually, it's more than 2, but there is some worked stone in there, so you know it could be very close. There's more in here, but again, are we looking at the edge of just a rocky outcrop, or is it worked stone? Obviously I can't take the foliage off to have a look, but this is roughly where the mill building should have been. Oh well, time for that hike up the hill again.